Everything we've been learning about energy and enzymes and metabolic pathways has been preparing us to talk about cellular respiration. And this is the process in which cells are going to be able to extract energy from organic molecules. And these are the organic molecules that we eat. So I'm going to add here food, right? So the goal of cellular respiration is to take organic molecules in our food and convert that into energy. And the overall goal is to turn it into ATP energy. So remembering our energy transformations, we're taking chemical energy in the form of things like glucose and transforming it into energy in the form of ATP, but this is also chemical energy. Why would we take chemical energy in one form and turn it into chemical energy in another form? That's because ATP is the dollar bill of the cell. So all of these things have value for energy. Glucose has value, fat has value, protein has value as energy. In the same way that a peso or a ruble or a euro has value as money. But in our country, as in the cell, we spend in one currency. So you might have thousands of rubles in the bank, but in order to spend that, you got to convert it to dollars. In the same way, we bring in food in various forms, but the way that our cell spends energy is in ATP. So this process is really going to convert the glucose energy and all this other food energy into the way that our cells like to spend energy, which is ATP. In the case of aerobic respiration, aerobic refers to oxygen. This is going to require oxygen, and it's going to produce CO2. So O2 is consumed or used, and CO2 is released or made. And this relates to a process that you're very familiar with and doing all the time, breathing. You have to bring in oxygen when you breathe, and you have to breathe out CO2. And the reason is because of this process of cellular respiration. Because in every single one of your cells, you're using oxygen, and every single one of your cells is releasing CO2. That gets collected and taken to your lungs and has to be breathed out. So we're going to focus on glucose metabolism. So this is still cellular respiration. But we take lots of different things like fat and protein and other sugars can all go into cellular respiration, and we'll come back and talk about that later on. But historically, we focus on glucose as a kind of model of what happens in metabolism. So many different things can be metabolized. We're going to start with glucose and understand it by looking at exactly what happens to glucose. There's four separate metabolic pathways that are part of cellular respiration. So it's this very long process with four distinct pathways: glycolysis, breakdown of pyruvate, the citric acid cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. So over the next couple of videos, we're going to be going through each one of these individually, but we'll start out by just looking at the big figure that overviews all four of those pathways. And I'm just going to write here that you need to know this figure. Pretty much everything on this figure is something that you need to memorize about cellular respiration. So be very, very familiar with this figure. So I'll walk through it as an overview, and then we'll go through each one of these steps in detail. So the very first stage of cellular respiration is glycolysis. It's going to start with a glucose molecule, and that glucose molecule will get split into two pyruvates. And so if I track carbons, so if I make, let me do it this way. Glucose is 6 carbons. Each pyruvate is only 3 carbons. So that's why I said it splits. And glycolysis literally means to split glucose. In the process of doing that splitting, Glycolysis produces 2 ATPs through substrate-level phosphorylation. Remember, this is when a phosphate is directly transferred to ADP from another molecule. So in the process, ATP is made, and in addition, so see how this arrow comes out of glycolysis, I also make 2-NADH. And let me also remind you that NAD+ is reduced to NADH. So redox reactions in glycolysis produce NADH. So that's glycolysis. It happens out in the cytosol. So the other part of this figure that's really important is the locations. This is occurring out in the cytosol. So then the next stage is breakdown of pyruvate. So these are my pyruvates, remember. They're going to travel into the next stage, and that's the breakdown of pyruvate. So the name's pretty straightforward there. So what happens in breakdown of pyruvate is that each one of these loses a carbon, and that is going to produce 2 CO2s. So that will leave behind these carbons called an acetyl group. So an acetyl group and an acetyl group. And these carbons come off as CO2. And that is also a redox reaction. I know that because here's NADH being made again. So coming out of the breakdown of pyruvate is more NADH, but no ATP. This occurs in the matrix of the mitochondria, which is this interior portion. So refresh your memory from chapter 4. The mitochondria has 2 membranes. It has an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And this area in here that I'm coloring in, that's called the matrix. And then this space right here, that now I'm coloring in a little bit, that's called the intermembrane space. So intermembrane means between membranes. Okay, so this part of it is occurring in the matrix on the very inside of the mitochondria. So from the breakdown of pyruvate, the 2 carbon molecules, remember that's these acetyl groups that I was talking about? These feed into the third part of cellular respiration, which is the citric acid cycle. Each one of these acetyl groups will be broken and release CO2s. So I have 2 acetyl groups going in, and so I'll get out 4 carbon dioxides. In the process, I'll produce 2 ATPs by substrate level phosphorylation, and I will also make 6 NADHs and 2 FADH2s. FAD is something we haven't seen before, but it's very similar to NAD+. FAD is reduced to FADH2 when it accepts electrons. So it is also an energy intermediate. So at the end of the citric acid cycle, all of my carbons have been shed as CO2. So glucose, remember, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. And at the end of the citric acid cycle, I've made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbon dioxides. So all of the carbons in glucose are now in carbon dioxide. So that only leaves the NADHs and FADH2s. So all of these are going to travel to the last stage of cellular respiration, which is oxidative phosphorylation. This is going to take the energy in NADH and FADH2 and convert all of that energy to ATP in a process called chemiosmosis. This is going to use a gradient to directly produce ADP from a free phosphate. And again, remember that's endergonic, so that's going to take the energy from here. So we're going to go through each one of these in detail. So if you didn't catch everything here, we're going to go through them again in much more detail in the next couple of videos.